Today we're telling a tragic story that involves a young man named Willis Hatfield. If that Hatfield name rings a bell, it should, for Willis is the youngest son of none other than Devil Anse Hatfield. This story, though, happens long after that famous Hatfield-McCoy feud. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullens, and this is another one of the stories of Appalachia.
It seems that people just can't get enough of these stories having to deal with the Hatfields or the McCoys. And this story right here, I think, Steve, more than anything tells about, how can I say it, the after effects, so to speak, of maybe what had happened between, Devil Anse and Randall McCoy. But this took place many years later.
Well, I think it does have something to do with something that did happen. If you recall, there was a infamous shooting incident in 1911 that involved a couple of Willis's brothers, and we've told that story, and we'll get into that more as we get into this today, just a few months before this occurred. So we'll just have to get in there and tell folks what's going on. And to be honest with you, this is another one of those Hatfield stories that just sort of pop up from time to time that I wasn't aware of, and I'm pretty sure you weren't aware of it either,
right.
That continues the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys.
These things are these stories, it just seems like, at a certain time, it's maybe like plants or flowers or something. You may not expect them to come up, but then suddenly out of the blue, here they come, and here comes a story, and this is one of those.
It is indeed. And the person we're talking about is Willis Hatfield, who was born right into the thick of it on February 10th, 1888, which just so happened to be a little over a month after one of the most notorious events of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, the deadly attack on the McCoy cabin. And while the Hatfield-McCoy feud had cooled off by the time Willis came of age, he certainly didn't escape the rough and tumble life that seemed to be the family's legacy.
While Willis got only as far as the 7th grade in school, that didn't stop him from taking on some pretty tough jobs. He worked as a deputy in Fayette County, West Virginia, a job that would have put him right in the middle of the action. But he didn't stop there. He also worked as a water plant operator and also as a coal miner. For a time, yes, he even ran a saloon. And speaking of saloons, this is where things start to really take a dark turn. Willis's brothers, Troy and Elias, also had a saloon in Boomer, West Virginia. In October 1911, the two were killed in a shootout with an Italian immigrant, Octavio Jerome. That sounds familiar, Steve. We've talked about this before, haven't we?
We've told that story. We sure have.
Okay. Well, Jerome was trying to take over their liquor and beer business, which, as you can imagine, it didn't go over very well with the Hatfields.
And just a few months later, on December 31st, 1911, Willis found himself in a situation that would change his life forever. He had ridden a train into Mullens, West Virginia, and walked into a local drugstore owned by a druggist named Phillips. Now, Mr. Phillips had been wounded, and a 35-year-old doctor named Edwin O. Thornhill had been called in to treat him. Thornhill, by the way, was visiting relatives in town when he got that call to come help. Well, anyway, Willis walked up to Dr. Thornhill and asked him for a prescription for a pint of whiskey. Now, Rod, keep in mind that this was during a time when doctors could write prescriptions for alcohol, but Thornhill refused. He was focused mainly on treating Phillips's wounds and didn't want to get involved in whatever it was that Willis had in mind. Well, as you can probably imagine, that refusal did not sit well with Willis Hatfield. He asked again, and Thornhill refused again. That's when Willis started cussing him out, creating a real scene there in the drugstore. Reports say that Thornhill either slapped or pushed Willis aside to get him out of the way, and Willis later claimed that the doctor had actually been punching him repeatedly, leading to him pulling out his gun.
Well, Steve, whether it was a slap or a punch, it doesn't make any difference. It still set Willis off. And he pulled out a revolver and he shot Dr. Thornhill 4 times, killing him, as they would say in Jerry Clower's terms, graveyard dead. okay? As if that was not enough, he walked up to the body and he shot it again at point blank range just to make sure he was dead. That's pretty bad. Okay, now, just like that, Willis calmly walked out of the drugstore and headed toward the train station. But he didn't get very far before two police officers, Saul Mace and Golden Fry. Golden Fry? That's a name?
Apparently so.
What, was his middle name French? Golden French Fry? Anyway, he caught up with him. Surprisingly, Willis didn't put up a fight. But in fact, he was more worried about an angry mob coming after him more than anything else. So he asked the officers to protect him from that mob. They took him under heavy guard to Pineville, and they put him in jail to keep him safe until the trial. Meanwhile, the town was left to deal with the shock of what had so happened.
Well, Rod, Dr. Thornhill had only been in Wyoming County for 4 years, having come from Lynchburg, Virginia. He wasn't married, and his death left a big void in the community. When the trial started in early March of 1912, it was a big deal, getting press coverage from all over the country simply because of, that Hatfield name. Willis was represented by his brother, CapHatfield, who'd become a lawyer in Logan County, along with 3 other attorneys. The trial was held under some pretty intense circumstances. Newspapers reported that the courtroom was practically an arsenal, with armed deputies stationed at every entrance and in the hallways. And if you remember correctly, this was right about the time that courthouse shootout in Hillsville happened.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't recall if it was before this or after it, but apparently there was enough tension there for either that reason or probably the fact that there were, according to the newspapers, about 100 Hatfield men coming into the courtroom to support him, that would be why they would go ahead and set up security as tight as they did. It must, though, have been that tense atmosphere. Cap Hatfield argued his brother's case, delivering a 40-minute long summation.
40 minutes long, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Well, despite all the tension, there was no trouble during the trial. Willis was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter. That's a big difference from involuntary manslaughter, okay? But voluntary manslaughter, and sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary by Judge James H. Miller. It seemed like justice had been served, at least to some extent. But the story doesn't end there. West Virginia had a law at the time called the Johnson Pistol Law. That's right, Johnson Pistol Law, which required anyone with a carry permit to post a $3,500 bond. If any person caused any damage with the firearm, the bond could be claimed as damages. In April, the administrator of Dr. Thornhill's estate tried to claim that bond from Willis and the estate of his late brother Elias, who had been the surety. Well, it was the first time that law had been tested in southern West Virginia, and in the end, the jury found in favor of Willis Hatfield in a 1913 trial, denying the claim. By that time, though, Willis had already been pardoned by the governor, William E. Glasscock, and released from prison.
And after that, Willis Hatfield went on to live a long life, passing away at the age of 90 in Huntington, West Virginia on May 25th, 1978. His story is just one of many told about the Hatfield clan, part of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. And I'm telling you, this is an interesting story. Mm-hmm. The governor, from what I can read, decided to pardon him at the end of his term there in 1913. It did not get into why he did that, whether there was any politics involved. In any event, just like so many other stories from that time, people get convicted for long sentences, and months later, in comes the governor and says, "Oh, nope, you're pardoned. Go on home." That's what happened here.
And you got to figure somewhere in there the name had to help, at least in one regard. And when I say help, I mean that, probably was the tipping of the scale to the injustice after all this had happened, because for some odd reason, I think there's another tale that I've heard at one time or another of where someone stood over somebody and, just shot them point blank and just did that just for the heck of it. And when I read this story and I heard about it and then I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, just to come up on the man and stand over top of him and shoot him just to make sure he's dead for good measure. The man's not moving. He can't be moving. He's not going to live, even if he does come through this, at the first few minutes. Go ahead and kill him. And that's what he did. And it's like he had we don't get anything indication in here about any kind of remorse out of the whole thing, but still, he was mad just because what? The doctor would not go and fill his prescription for what? Whiskey.
Yeah.
He wouldn't take the time to do it, so.
Well, there are a couple of different stories, depending on which newspaper you look at for this time period. One of the stories is that he was already a bit drunk and wanted some more whiskey and thought that the doctor would go ahead and write him a prescription, which apparently at the time was something you had to do.
Right.
And the doctor, seeing him drunk, just didn't want to fool with him. And I would say he had no idea who this guy was or who he was related to either. Well, so being drunk, he shot him and then turned around and made sure he was shot when he shot him basically in the head. So, a very brutal story. There's nothing in there in any of the other stories to indicate that he tried to use that as any kind of a defense. So I don't know if that part was true or not.
Well, and you think of it, unless he was really constantly bombarded and seeing the papers, like you said, I'm sure the doctor probably didn't know anything about the Hatfields unless he'd picked up a paper and saw the ongoing battles in some of the newspapers. He probably had no idea. Being in Lynchburg, Virginia, and then transplanting to West Virginia there and around the West Virginia-Kentucky border, you're not going to hear about things like that. And so, he was just doing his doctor duty, and that's what he was doing, and unfortunately was snubbed out by a Hatfield.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, 2 months before this, as we said, his two brothers were killed in that shootout.
Right.
So we don't know what he was dealing with emotionally because of that. And he may well have taken to drink because of that. Yep. There was an interview of him when he was 89 years old that was conducted by a student at, I forget which college it is, but you can find this online. They didn't get very far because he wasn't feeling well, so they didn't get into this particular episode. But he did give a little bit of background on what he had done, and that's where I found the things that he did over his life as far as jobs and things like that. It's a very interesting thing, and he just seemed like just your regular old man talking to somebody. And just keep in mind that his daddy was Devil Anse Hatfield.
Yeah. Yeah.
And folks, that's the story of Willis Hatfield's brush with the law. Another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, don't miss out on any of our stories. Be sure to subscribe to the Stories Podcast, and you can do that at Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, our YouTube channel, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.